In the last video, we talked about different frequency areas and what things we often can find in a mix in those areas. And in this video, we're also going to look at different frequency areas, but today we are going to listen from a more stereo-oriented point of view. We are going to see what can we find in the M signal, what can we find in the S signal, and how can we use MSEQ to make a mix sound a bit wider, and how to make certain elements pop out a bit more, and how to manipulate the size and the width of the soundstage in a mix. And first we can talk a little bit about MS, or mid-side. This is sometimes called the sum and difference as well, and that's because the M signal contains the sum of the left and right channels, and the S signal contains the difference between the left and right channels. And it's an alternative way to represent a stereo signal, and it opens up many possibilities for tweaking a stereo mix. And we can start by just listening a bit to a mix and hear how it sounds in stereo, and listen to how it sounds when we're listening to just the M signal, and then also listen to the S signal, so that we get a sort of feeling for what we can find in the M signal and in the S signal. And in the M signal, in the mono signal, we will usually find things that are panned to the center. In this case, we can hear, for example, the kick drum and the snare drum and the lead vocals are quite present in the mono signal. And in the S signal, we will find the wide elements of the mix. And if I then would use an equalizer and set a band to only affect the mid, the M signal, then you can get some sort of control over how the vocals sound, for example, without affecting the complete stereo mix. So if I wanted to make the vocals a bit more present in the mix, I could, for example, add a bit of mids in the M signal, and that would make the vocals pop out a bit more.
Time is crashing through the street, and it's bold and beautiful to me when I shake the dust off of the car, and you take your smile back to the start, don't you?
And if I wanted to make the electric guitars a bit more edgy, then I can somewhat reach them by using an EQ in the S signal, because the guitars are panned to the sides a bit, so I would then be able to make the guitars pop out a bit more without affecting the centered lead vocals that much.
Through the street, and it's bold and beautiful to me when I shake the dust off of the car, and you take your smile back to the start, don't you? And it's always.
And once you start using an MSEQ, it's very common to do a bit too much of it, so to speak. But if you use it in a sort of sensible way, then it can be a really good tool to have in order to make more subtle changes to a mix. So we're going to look at some frequency areas and see what we can find in those areas, and see how we can manipulate things using MSEQ, and also what to look out for when doing so. And I will be using this Equilibrium plugin from DMG Audio, but you can use other EQs for this as well. There are many plugin options for mid-side equalization these days. And we can start with the bass. We can listen a bit to the low end and listen to how it sounds both in stereo and then also the M signal only and the S signal only. Sounds like this. Let's see, something like that. And in this mix, the bass guitar and the kick drum is quite centered, and they are audible mostly in the M signal, pretty much only in the M signal. And in the S signal, we can hear a bit of ambience and also the lower parts of the organ and the backing vocals. We can hear those in the M signal as well, but they are kind of overpowered by the kick and bass. And when the lead vocals begin, we can hear the lowest parts of the lead vocals in the M signal as well, but none of it in the S signal. And this is a well-behaved mix with a low end that is balanced and centered. And it's very common that mixes are quite centered in the low end. And centered doesn't necessarily mean that the low end is in mono, but rather that there is balance between the left and the right channel. There is a lot of weight in the low end of a mix, so if the left and right balance is off in the bass, then it can feel as if the mix is very unstable or as if it's tilting. But that's not the case here. This is a very well-balanced mix in that regard. And one way to make a master sound bigger and wider without changing the mix balances too much is to add a bit of low end in the side signal. And this can be done by using a shelving filter or a wide peak filter sometimes, and set it to only process the side signal. And we can have a listen to how that sounds.
Off of the car and you take your smile back to the start, don't you? And there's always another day, and there's always another way, and I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now? Cracked and gone.
And I have exaggerated this now to make the effect more audible here on YouTube. Normally I would probably use a dB or so if I'm using this trick. And it makes the sound very deep and wide without changing too much of the balances within the mix. So it's often a quite subtle and useful trick, especially if we would do it with a smaller boost than this. And the reason why this works is that most of the time the bass-heavy instruments of the mix are centered in the stereo image, so we won't affect the balances of those things by EQing the side signal in the bass. So when we add some low end to the side signal, then we are instead adding a bit of weight to the panned instruments, and that sort of makes the mix sound a bit fuller and wider. And it doesn't always work, it very much depends on the mix. Sometimes the bass is already too wide or unbalanced in some way in the mix, and then if we add more low end to the side signal, then it can make the mix even more unbalanced and even more unstable. And then it can be better to make the low end narrower instead. We can do that with a shelving filter like this, or we can use a low cut filter in the S signal. And for this mix that isn't really needed, but if you are sending a master out for vinyl cutting, then this can sometimes be done by the cutting engineer. And that is because wide bass can take up a lot of space on the record, and it can potentially also make the needle skip when you play the record. So if you're sending a master to vinyl cutting, then you shouldn't necessarily do this yourself unless it actually sounds better, but you can be aware that the cutting engineer might choose to remove bass in the side signal when cutting. Okay, so we talked about the lower mids in the last video, and that the lower mids often make the mix sound warm and cozy, but adding too much low mids can also make the mix sound a bit too muddy. And one way to make a mix more warm and more cozy without making it more muddy is to add a bit of low mids to the S signal instead. So you sort of widen the stereo image in the lower mids. And if the centered elements of the mix have enough clarity higher up in the frequency spectrum, then you can sometimes get a more embracing sound by doing this. So let's add a bit of lower mids to the side and hear how that sounds.
Yeah, there's always another day. Yeah, there's always another way. And I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now? And I don't give much away, and you don't have much to say. Looks like it's about to rain.
So it's a way to get a warmer sound without making the lead vocals too muddy sounding. The lead vocals are often panned to the center as they are here, but we also need to make sure that the mix balances don't change too much. In this case, the backing vocals get quite a bit louder and also the keyboards. So it's easy to make the ambience and the panned elements of the mix pop out a bit too much when adding low mids to the sides. But just as with the low end, a little bit can go a long way. So maybe a dB can be enough to give this sort of warm, embracing feeling to the mix. And maybe if you already have added low end in the sides to the mix, you maybe want to skip adding the lower mids, because it can often be a bit much to do both of those things. And we can move a bit higher up in the frequency spectrum and have a look at the mids of the mids, so to speak, around 400 hertz up to, say, 2 kilohertz or so. And this is an area that I will often leave as it is when it comes to stereo width, because it's very easy to change the balances within the mix by manipulating the width of the mix. We can have a listen to what we can find in this area. We can listen to the mids isolated, and then the mono signal, and then the side signal.
Yeah, there's always another day. Yeah, there's always another way. And I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now? And I don't give much away, and you don't have.
So let's say that I add a bit of mids in the side signal. We can hear how that sounds. I'm doing this with a quite wide filter around, say, 1 kilohertz or so.
Yeah, there's always another day. Yeah, there's always another way. And I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now? And I don't give much away, and you don't have much to say. Looks like it's about to rain.
And now the lead vocals get quite overpowered by the panned instruments and the room sound. And the mix gets wider and maybe a bit more impressing at first glance, but the balances are completely changed. And this is very similar to what happens when you increase the overall level of the S signal, like when using a stereo width control of some kind. It's very easy to make the lead vocals disappear into the mix. And this added width can be sort of tempting and sound great at first, but the music often suffers from it, unless, of course, the mix just happens to benefit from less lead vocals. That can also happen, of course. But we can also use it the other way around, like we did earlier in the video. If the lead vocals need a bit of a push forward in the mix, then we can add a bit of mids to the M signal and make the vocals more present. Otherwise, it can be better to go back to the mix and fix it there, or maybe use a vocal up version of the mix if that exists. Okay, so let's have a look at the upper mids. The area around, say, 2 kHz up to 6 kHz or so. This is an important area for how we perceive the width of a mix. Because in the upper mids we will find a lot of the texture and the transient parts of the mix. And these transients and the texture will help guiding the ears to where each of the elements in the mix are positioned. And we can start by listening a bit to the upper mids. And I will switch between the full stereo signal and also the M signal and the S signal, so we can sort of get a feeling of what we can find there.
Junk is floating through the air, and I know enough not to stare, but I hear yelling to the roof, tell me, and it's always another day, and there's always another way, and I keep getting stuck and say, where are we?
So once again we can hear the lead vocals clearly in the M signal, but in the S signal we can hear the backing vocals quite prominently, and also the acoustic guitars and things like that. And there is a lot of the transient sounds from the guitars and from the vocals. We can hear the consonants in the vocals and also the string, the attack sounds in the guitars. So if we help spreading these transients and this texture out a bit in the stereo field, then we can expand how we perceive the width of the soundstage. So I will set this to only the side and then add quite a bit of level in the upper mids here, just so we can hear how that affects the stereo width of this.
Junk is floating through the air, and I know enough not to stare, but I held the door without a clue, and you drove the nail into the roof, tell me, and it's always another day, and there's always another way, and I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now?
So it's an exaggerated example once again, but it shows the potential of using a method like this in a more subtle way. 1 dB or so is usually enough to get a bit more spacious stereo image without drastically changing the sound of the mix. And when you do this, you can listen for how present the vocals sound and make sure that the things out to the sides doesn't get brighter or more present than the lead vocals. It's always about the balance and about the contrast between the different elements of the mix. And the lead vocals should mostly be the most present sound in a mix. That's usually one of the key elements of a mix, and you want that to be in focus and present. So if you're adding upper mids to the side in order to make the mix sound wider, then you will also need to make sure that the panned elements doesn't get brighter and more present than the lead vocals, because that will sound kind of funny, as it did in this example, because it was a bit too exaggerated. But you can hopefully hear how this kind of EQ could help certain mixes to sound wider and more exciting. In metal music, you will often find the edginess of the guitars in the upper mids, and the guitars are often fully panned to the left and to the right. So it's often possible to sort of manipulate the aggressiveness and the size of the guitars by using MSEQ. So we can listen to this example. First we will hear the full mix and then hear the mono signal and then the S signal, and listen for the guitars and how they sound in M and S. So in the M signal we can hear the guitars, but we also hear the drums quite clearly. But in the S signal we can hear more of the guitars. There are other instruments there as well, but the guitars are almost dominant in the S signal. So if we want to manipulate the sound of the guitars, then we can reach them by EQing the S signal. So let's do that. We can do the tweaks while listening to the S signal. So this is a quite drastic change, it's exaggerated, but you can hear that it's possible to manipulate the size and the presence of the panned guitars by using EQ in the S signal only. And if you want to do drastic changes like this, then it's usually better to go back to the mix if that's possible, just as with the sound of the vocals. But often you can use smaller EQ tweaks than this, and if you put them in the right spots when mastering, you can often make quite big perceived improvements to the sound of the mix. So let's have a listen to the last frequency area, and this is the highs from approximately 6 kHz or so and upwards. And first let's listen to the isolated highs, and I will switch between the full stereo signal and the M signal and the S signal. So in the highs we can find the sparkle and the details of the mix, and if the lead vocals and main elements that are panned to the center already are bright enough, which I think they are in this mix, then we can sometimes add a bit of air to the S signal instead, and that can be a bit more subtle than adding highs to the full mix. We can hear how it sounds, and I will exaggerate this as well. So listen to how the highs sort of opens up without the lead vocals getting brighter, but also listen to what happens with the backing vocals when doing this.
Junk is floating through the air, and I know enough not to stare, but I held the door without a clue, and you drove the nail into the roof. Tell me, and it's always another day, and there's always another way, and I keep getting stuck and say, where are we heading to now?
So it sounds more spacious and it has more air, but we also get more sibilance and brightness in the backing vocals, because those are panned to the sides, so they are also affected by this increase of highs in the side signal. And this makes the S sounds in the backing vocals quite sharp to my ears. And that's one of the things to look out for when using MSEQ in the high end. This time it's the backing vocals that get sibilant, but it can also be the lead vocals that get sibilant. For example, if there is reverb on the vocals and the S sounds sort of splashes out into the sides, that can be exaggerated by doing this kind of EQ. So that's something to keep an ear on when using this method. And just as with the upper mids, we need to make sure that the lead elements that often are panned to the center doesn't get more dull sounding compared to the panned instruments. Like here we had the backing vocals getting too bright, but also the acoustic guitar that got quite a bit brighter by doing this. There can also be percussive instruments that are panned to the sides that get fronted more when adding highs to the S signal, just as the acoustic guitar was in this example. We can also listen to another example. This is a jazz tune. And listen to how the ride cymbal sounds. It's panned to the left in this mix. Here the ride cymbal gets quite a bit more pronounced and bright sounding, and that could be a good thing, but it could also be that the level of the ride was already considered and decided upon during the mix. So if we would add highs like this during mastering, then that would rebalance a musically important element like the ride cymbal, and it could be that this is not what the artist or producer wanted. So that's something to be aware of. So now we have listened to a few examples of frequency areas and how we can use mid-side EQ to manipulate the stereo image in those frequency ranges. And in several of these examples, we have used MSEQ to add energy to the S signal, to the side signal. And we have heard how we can use that to make the mix sound wider in different ways. And one thing to note is that it's usually better to add energy in one or maybe two areas of a mix, because when you increase the gain in the S signal in several frequency areas, that's pretty much the same as just adding stereo width using a normal width control. So you will often get the best results when you do it more selectively in one or two areas. And if you haven't worked with MSEQ before, then you're in for a good time, and you will probably find it quite tempting to use a bit too much of this MSEQ to begin with. I know that I did that when I started using MSEQ many years ago. It's such a fun and powerful tool to use on a mix, so it's easy to overdo it. But that's all good. It takes a bit of experimentation to find the limits of what sounds good and what doesn't sound good. And hopefully this video has been helpful in pointing out a few things to listen for while using MSEQ. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.